Welcome, everyone. I'm here tonight with Don Moynihan, and we're going to talk about Civic Tech, the Civic Tech movement, what it is and what its implications are, why it matters. Before we get started, I just want to thank some of the ISPS staff who helped to organize today's meeting, Rick Harrison and Pam Green. And the format for our conversation tonight is I'm going to talk with Don for maybe 40 minutes or so, 35 or 40 minutes. And then if there are any questions from the participants, we'll turn over the conversation to the participants' questions. Put your questions in the chat and we'll take them from there. This conversation tonight is part of the programming of ISPS. The Institution for Social and Policy Studies is a nonpartisan research center. Among our other activities, we have discussions of matters of public importance and interest on representation, elections, democracy, and government performance. And tonight's meeting is part of those efforts. So with that, let me just get started. Let me just jump right in. Don, welcome. So I read your Substack. And one of the things you wrote recently was the following: most members of the public have little reason to be aware of 18F or will understand what its loss signifies. And I think that's very fair. Why don't you tell me a little bit about 18F and what its loss signifies?
Yeah, and I think no one is to blame if you've not heard of 18F. This is one of two entities that was created in the aftermath of the healthcare.gov debacle, which I think is reasonable to call it a debacle, and bringing us back to that time period. During the second Obama administration, one of his major goals was to make healthcare more accessible, and a mechanism for doing that was to build this healthcare.gov website. And the website didn't work. On the first day, it opened. A grand total of about 6 people were able to access health insurance. It basically collapsed. And if you read Obama's autobiography, he's very upfront in saying this was a disaster on my watch. And it calls him to think about how do we improve government capacity in a way that presidents don't normally have those conversations or thoughts. And his solution was to create some in-house units that try to get the people who came from Silicon Valley and eventually helped to save and resurrect healthcare.gov, and to keep that type of talent in government. Historically, government has had a very hard time attracting and retaining tech talent, especially in a time period when people with that sort of talent could earn multiples of their salary in the private sector. And so the result of that moment was the creation of the US Digital Service and the 18F. And these were sort of, you should think of them as sister organizations that help to inculcate talent, help to bring in civic technologists into government. They had slightly different missions, but the shared mission was, how do you modernize government services and government systems? And this obviously might sound familiar because now we're 10 years on from that moment. They celebrated their 10-year anniversary last year, and now we have a different approach where DOGE is also promising to bring technologists into government to modernize services. But much of what the Civic Tech movement did, I think, was bring in people who genuinely believed in the government as a force for good, and believed that building government capacity was a way to improve the quality of government services. And I think they were also a little bit surprised when they got to government by how far behind we were in certain areas. And I think it is, generally true that the U.S. made some strategic choices in the 1990s and early aughts, which involved not investing in technological modernization, but instead assuming that they could simply contract out that capacity, which turned out to be a mistake. So from that moment, 18F and US Digital Service created these teams within government to solve problems, build new products. Crucially, also 18F helped agencies write open source software and manage their vendor relationships. And so, for example, I had one former 18F employee write on my blog about his experiences, and he said over a 3-day time period, my team saved the Department of Defense $500 million in contract costs that they would have otherwise paid by improving services. And so they had a very large impact, but also one that was often difficult for the public to see. I think that is one thing that sort of stays with us at this moment when both of these entities no longer really exist, because the US Digital Service has now become the US DOGE service. Most of the prior members have left, and 18F was terminated by DOGE a couple of months ago.
Yeah. So a couple quick questions about that. First of all, 18F is an unusual name for an entity. It's probably wasn't. It didn't go through like a branding process. I imagine they said the name that we love is 18F. Well, what do you know why it was called? It's called 18F.
I believe it was a reference to physical address,
Oh, okay.
that they were based at the space that had 18F attached to it.
Nice. Okay. And then you mentioned essentially build versus buy when it comes to technology. Um, I guess as you start to think about government and technology, that comes up immediately. Like, to what extent are you going to have in-house capacity versus to what extent are you going to have a procurement process? Can you say just a bit about how we have made that decision generally? Like which side of that have we come down upon, and do you want to just comment on that a little bit?
Sure. I think we came down very clearly on the side of contracting out for services. And if you go back to the 1990s, with the Clinton administration, there was a strong emphasis on downsizing in quite a different way from what DOGE has been doing, but it was still downsizing, with the assumption that many services could be bought in the private market and would be better quality and cheaper than if the government tried to build in-house. At the same time, you also had Newt Gingrich close an office of technology transformation in Congress. And so there was sort of a bipartisan agreement at this time that tech is wonderful, but government should not be in the business of building or managing tech. And I think intuitively that makes tremendous sense. And it's only probably been in the last few years where I've really started to pay more attention to how tech works in government, that I think that proved to be an expensive mistake. And to be clear, I don't think government is ever going to build all of the tech that it uses, but it should have enough capacity to build products that it needs quickly. It should have that capacity in-house, and it should also have the capacity to manage vendors. And so in many cases, you have government contractors who have way more sophistication about the technology than the government employees that they're dealing with. And so they have this really large information advantage that they can take advantage of then in contract situations. What results then is we often have um, government products that take too long to build, do not really serve the needs of government terribly well, because government might have asked for thing A 3 years ago, and then by the time the thing is built 3 years later, they actually wanted something else. Sometimes it's not the fault of the contractor. And it doesn't really lend itself to iterative learning or back and forth between the users of services and the way in which we procure those services. And one sort of very simple way of thinking about this, and Jen Palka, who was like a founding creator of the US Digital Service, has talked about this in her book, Recoding America, where she talks about the difference between a waterfall model of contracting, where you specify in a detailed contract, here is what you're going to build for us. and a more agile approach, which involves a lot more back and forth where you're piloting, testing, engaging in iterative learning, especially with products that are meant to be in front of consumers, getting feedback from them and rebuilding. And so you're moving and pivoting all the time. And we built our procurement processes around the waterfall logic, which probably works okay if you're doing things like building ships, but it doesn't work quite as well if you're building software products, especially ones that the public is going to use.
Yeah. You mentioned the civic tech movement and the 18F and the U.S. Digital Services in some ways represents part of it, almost like an early flowering of the civic tech movement. Can you just say a bit more about what you mean by the civic tech movement, and what were its values, what were its contours?
Yeah, and I think there are sort of key moments. One is 2014 when USDS and 18F were built up. Then there were some prior moments around 2010, 2011. You see these offices in some cities like Boston and Philadelphia, which are offices of digital innovations, usually in mayor's offices. And then prior to that, you see some sort of bottom-up, more voluntary hackathons where people who are just and here's where the shared values are. They're sort of collectively interested in the idea of government that is a potential force for helping people in the world, and B, working with a technological framework that is outdated and not super helpful for members of the public. And so I think generically we should think about these as mostly skilled technologists who have a pro-social motivation. That is to say, they believe in government. They think that modernizing government capacity is important. And so they're invested in that as a broader project. And it evolved from being this sort of outsider movement, which, if you look at Code for America, which is a big nonprofit player in this space, how they started was putting people who are volunteers and pairing them with cities, and then they eventually figured out, no, we need to work more directly with government, because simply having this sort of outsider status is not enough to get things done. But they retain this sort of pro-social motivation for how do you fix and modernize government services.
Can you say you mentioned these were people who stepped forward to tackle from the outside a government technology problem and a hackathon about a government website or something like that. See if we can improve the user interface for some website. The folks who volunteer for this, their heart, you describe them as motivated and by social motivations, so their heart was in the right place. Were these people good at this? How would you compare the technological capabilities of folks who ended up at places like 18F and the U.S. Digital Service to, whatever would be the equivalent private sector? It would be probably the user experience group at a tech company, for example, and some of the software engineers at tech companies.
I think mostly the folks who floated into places like 18F and USDS were quite good at what they did. And some of them had come from places like Amazon and Google and were partly looking for more meaningful work where they felt like, I have the skill set, but I want to do something other than A/B testing to help Amazon sell more products. And so
You're talking to an experimentalist, so that's very that hurts. Fantastic. I'm kidding. Go ahead. Sorry.
But they brought some of those values then into government. So the idea of design thinking, like building around the needs of users, the idea of testing, like whether one version of a product or another worked better, the idea of rapid learning cycles, like where you have feedback that occurs not once a year with a performance feedback process, but weekly or monthly. You figure out what you're doing and you iterate and improve. They brought some of those values into government. Now, I think there's, like with any population, there's variation. And I think there were some of those who were in this more voluntary outsider status who saw going into government as selling out, right? That it was, you're becoming part of the system. And I think, I've also talked to people who said, like some of those early voluntary things, people were there just to burnish their CV. So they would have, much like volunteering to get into college, they would have something when they went to an employer to say, look, I care about the broader world. But for the people who invested time in going into government, they typically were pretty skilled, as best as I can tell, and were highly motivated to improve public services.
When you said that folks realized that, there are attempts to kind of improve things and using the hackathons or, more episodic interactions with government service provision were working well. Could you characterize like, as movements mature, they change, they learn, they improve. What were some of the things that, we would say now were misconceptions that people in this space had that they realize were misconceptions that are kind of like lessons that we should know about how one might successfully work with government?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things that reflected a certain amount of naivety in the first version of the movement. And I've recently written about this and said, here are the things that Doge could have learned from the civic tech movement, but maybe didn't think about. One is about the role of transparency. And I think in particular for people who come from the tech world, they put such a strong emphasis on values like open data and open code as mechanisms of diffusion of good idea. Like if you just put the data out there, if you just put the code out there, good things will happen. And so the idea that you could just build some sort of tool that would free up data and then you post that online and then suddenly governments would pick this up and transform themselves. Like that was sort of a working assumption for a while. That was part of the theory of power, is that transparency would help you succeed. And then after a few years, they realized that theory of power was pretty flawed. And in talking to some of them, they would say things like, it turns out like city managers want you to build products, right? They don't want a bunch of open source code that they then have to make sense of, right? And they want you to build it within the parameters of government. And so I think that was one big lesson. Transparency is not enough to actually make change. You have to roll up your sleeves and get into government. And I think the second big lesson, and it sounds simple, is that working in government is harder than you think. And it requires a lot more than tech skills. And multiple times when I've talked to people in the space, I've heard a variation on the expression, the tech is the easy part. Like building the tech is not the hard part. It's building within the context of government and getting buy-in and support and negotiating partnerships and stakeholders within government. That's a challenge. And doing it in a way that doesn't violate the law, that, respects things like at the federal level, we have, for example, the Privacy Act, which is pretty constraining when it comes to data sharing. It also requires a certain humility where you then respect some of the people that you might have dismissed as bureaucrats or stuck in the mud or too wedded to the status quo, that often they are doing what they're doing for a reason that might not have been apparent to you coming into government simply because you don't know the policy domain or you don't know the law terribly well. And some of the constraints really are stickier and are based in statute than you might have assumed.
The way you describe this, at least in the particular examples, it was a description of some folks from outside of government seeing a need and then taking action and then bringing certain values into government, and work habits or habits of mind regarding what producing a product was like, and things like, as you said, A/B testing and iterative processes, things like that. that makes it sound a little bit like a push story. To what extent, where is, in your view, and now going back to your point about theory of power, we're talking about government performance, and so the citizenry has an interest in excellent government performance. Presumably, in some civics class version of politics, the citizenry would be pressuring politicians who would then in turn get rewarded or punished based on the performance of the bureaucracies that are under their control. It seems like in the depiction that you gave, you didn't describe any politicians, you didn't describe the agencies themselves reaching out and saying, we have a problem, help us solve it. Maybe a little bit with respect to the U.S. Digital Service case, but I don't know if that's the typical case. So can you say something about, tell me how you think about the public's role in all of this, and if it's fair to say that their demands or their insistence on performance and their punishment for poor performance seems somewhat muted, I would say, in the political system. But tell me a little bit more about that, like what I would think of as maybe the demand side of this system.
Yeah, I mean, I think a classic policy feedback story is the public is unhappy with the status quo. There's an incentive for politicians to improve the status quo in terms of service delivery. The public notices, and then they reward that politician, and that creates a virtuous circle. And I think like that is the version of politics and democracy and implementation that we would love to see in place, but it doesn't always work that way. I think there's perhaps a different type of set of incentives, which is politicians learn over time that disastrous government projects draw attention. But when things work well, maybe they don't get quite the political credit that they deserve. And I think you see a little bit of that in the Civic Tech experience, which is that they never had a really large portfolio. The U.S. Digital Service was often a firefighter, something would go wrong, and they would be called in to try and fix the problem. Um, as opposed to a different framework where we had something that would be equivalent to a Ministry of Digital Transformation, and they had a genuine cross-government license to modernize the way in which services are built and delivered. And they never really had that. And, one of the things I've heard talking to people in the space is we never had someone with the visibility and clout of an Elon Musk on our side, right? And even though I think the vast majority of the people in that movement would disagree with the goals of Musk, there was maybe a certain small measure of envy in that you had this incredible momentum and willingness to take on big projects and do them very quickly that they never really had. They were constantly trying to build stakeholders into their camp and establish partnerships to get things done. I was talking to someone last week who worked on the direct file project, and I think, that is one example I want to get into a little bit more depth. If you haven't heard of it, direct file was this free online tax reporting system that had been piloted for 2 years. People who used it loved it. It had incredibly positive customer evaluation scores, and that was killed a couple of months ago. And the person I was talking to said, well, maybe if we had 12 direct files, that would have broken through. Like, we needed not just one of those in its early stages, we needed a whole bunch of them that was moving much more quickly. And I think this is another challenge for the civic tech movement, is that it's hard to point to really visible things that they created that made people's lives better. Another example would be renewing your passport online. USDS was involved in that project. That apparently seems to work really well. They were also brought in to help fix problems with the new FAFSA application process. And so again, they were brought in when something was going wrong, as opposed to given a license to build something new. So you don't get a ton of credit for that. And so there have been ways in which they have made people's lives work better, just not always visible to the public.
Yeah, and just if you had who's when you describe these efforts, like let's get well-meaning skilled technologists in government to help make sure that our procurement is done well, that our projects are well organized, that there's a learning cycle. This sounds like a really good idea. It's almost hard to see how there's another side to this argument in some sense. If these folks are willing to work at a fraction of what they could work for in the private sector, you would think this would be something overwhelmingly popular at the federal level, but also state and local. This seems like every federal government should have an 18F, but really so should every state and every locality. What is it that, is it the case that these things are more common at the local and state level? Are there barriers to setting these sorts of things up? Who's against this in a sense?
I think there are maybe two battles to be fought for the civic tech movement. One is the broader vendor community, so the actors who can turn a profit in providing tech services to government. And there is, often discussion about vendor lock-in, where they have essentially established a private monopoly in providing tech services to government, which in the views of many in the civic tech community is then going to be prone towards rent-seeking, higher costs for poor products. And for that vendor community, they have strong extrinsic incentives to keep the political economy working the way it is. And so I think there is a little bit of tension, and this is an issue that the civic tech movement is either going to have to become more explicit about, or they will, I think, struggle to exist, which is that they will say quietly that this is a problem, but they often won't be really explicit in saying we're going to take on traditional vendors. And I think partly there's also a critical mass issue of whether they really have enough people in the community to replace some of those traditional vendors, which are huge operations in many states. I think the second challenge is just one of our partisan politics, which is that the pro-social motivation that I mentioned before, I think can also be read in partisan terms. And again, we have this quite distinct, I think, worldview between what DOGE represents at the federal level and what civic tech does. And so to the extent that that becomes perceived then as a conflict, you might see a little bit more of states like Florida, or I think the legislature in Arizona have talked about doing their own DOGE initiatives, whereas other states, I think, are trying to hire former 18F and former U.S. Digital Service employees. And so you might see a little bit of a bifurcation depending on partisan ideology, which for the record, I think is unfortunate. I think you should have at least enough tech capacity in-house that if what you're buying is value for money, even if you're buying it from the private marketplace and the traditional tech vendors.
Yeah, I was going to say, Don, that last comment, I think, is the answer to your observation about are there enough people to replace, the large tech companies, the large consulting companies that specialize in federal contracts. There's thousands of employees from, I'm not going to say specific companies, but certain companies have thousands and thousands of employees that were involved in federal contracting. You don't need to replace them. You need to do a better job of managing them. And I don't think you need to, there are different ways you can go, right? You mentioned differentiation across places in the response to the last 12 months or something, but But are there places that you can point to as like beacons of light or something in this area, either states or localities or mayors that are like really visionary, or countries that are just doing this like much better than the United States, and we can learn a lot from.
I think internationally, people always look to places like Estonia, in Denmark. The US digital service is partly based on a UK model. And I think there is like generically a sense that the US is being lapped by other countries when it comes to the quality of government service delivery in digital spaces. Um, and I think that's a fair, I visit Denmark a few times a year, and I think that is a fair evaluation. Like the simplicity and quality of government service delivery in those places is clearly better than in the US. Now, there's some weird reasons for that. Some of our systems are just inherently more complicated, like our tax system is more complicated than in most other countries. Our healthcare system is more complicated than in other countries. And so in some cases, the digital products reflect the constraints and complexities that come with that. Within the US, I think Colorado has won sort of plaudits for its digital expertise. New Jersey has invested a lot. I wrote a paper recently about Pennsylvania, about Governor Shapiro's efforts there to use a new organization called Code PA to speed up permitting and to, facilitate not just better citizen experiences in accessing government services, but also for small and large businesses as well. So I do think there are some bright spots. And I think, if I was a smart Democratic governor who was trying to make a name for myself, or even on the Republican side, by saying, there's a way to modernize government and I'm going to show you how to do it, this would be something to invest in. Like this sort of capacity, I think, would be something that you could show the voters in a couple of years and say, this is why you should have confidence that I'll be able to govern.
Terrific. So let me just remind the participants who are watching. We'd love to get your questions. So if you could send questions to the chat, we can answer. We can start to transition to questions for Don. So let me just ask a couple that have come across the transom. What are some, would you care, you've given a few examples of specific successes of civic tech initiatives, direct file, you discussed a few others. Is there any others that you'd like to just highlight, like maybe a few successes, and then if there's anything that wasn't as successful, any large effort that wasn't as successful, and maybe what we might have learned from that experience as well.
Yeah, I'll say something more about one I mentioned in passing, which is just modernizing renewal of U.S. passports, because I think that holds both some good and bad lessons. My understanding is that if you went back to the Obama era, there was an initiative to allow digital renewal of passport applications. And so it was this 10-year project or something close to a 10-year project to actually get this happening. And I think they were on their third set of contractors by the time it actually occurred. And partly it occurred because the US Digital Service joined the team and helped to rebuild some of the processes that had been put in place. And so I think it reflects both the political economy, where contractors had built products that just didn't work terribly well, and then the way in which USDS was used, which is rather than invite them in at the start to build a thing from scratch, they were called in when things didn't seem to be working well to sort of put out the fire and rebuild the structure. The other thing I think that's telling about that example is, if you've done this, if you've renewed your passport in the last, I think, 8 or 9 months, it's almost magical, right? It works. It's so much better than going to the post office or having all of these paper forms that you really recognize it. I was staying with my mother-in-law last Christmas when she like sent off her new passport application. She got it back in 5 days, and she was so impressed by that, right? Like that stuck out to her as a good experience. And I think though it like the issue was partly scale. Like, did we have enough of those tangible improvements and experiences? And then credit. Like, who gets the credit for that? Is it the previous president? Is it the US Digital Service? Probably not the US Digital Service because State Department is the one issuing the passports. So to me, that feels like both sort of a good success story but also one that illustrates some of the limits of the political credit claiming that come from these
Yeah,
successes.
let me follow up on that. Don, that's a great point. Like of course, this is something that been a better experience, and you would ideally want the folks who produce the better experience to get credit for that better experience. Do we have any scholarship on how people assign blame or credit for their experience with the passport service going well or poorly? Obviously, not just that, but things like that.
We don't have anything that I'm aware of with passport services.
Yeah, yeah.
I think generically, we know one thing for sure is that people remember bad experiences. And so this is the classic psychological insight about loss aversion, which is that negative experiences affect us and we remember them much more than than positive experiences. And I think that holds true with government services. I've been doing some research to try and find whether we can find any sort of causal impact. And so, for example, one project I've been working on is looking at Medicaid renewals and when governments automated those Medicaid renewals and saved people a bunch of paperwork, do people feel more trusting of government and do they have more positive view of government? And there is at least some evidence that they do feel more positively towards government and are more trusting in government and are more supportive of making services simpler when they had their renewal processes automated versus go through the more onerous.
How do you study that? How do you study that? Is that like it's introduced in a place, you do a difference in differences sort of study? Is that what you did?
We basically take advantage of a natural experiment where, in this case, the state of Minnesota wanted to expand automatic renewals for Medicaid clients, and it had enough data to do automatic renewals for about 70% of them. It didn't have
Oh, great,
for
great.
30% of them. And then we survey those people months later, and everyone has gotten the benefit at this point. But we asked them, was it easy? Was it hard? And we find that people who went through the paperwork process said it was harder, which is good, which is what you'd expect. And then we asked them about their trust in government. And we find not enormous, but we do find significant differences where people who have not had to do the onerous paperwork process express higher trust in government.
Okay. Do they give credit to any particular politicians for this success?
We asked them about every level of government and not politicians. And this is partly because we got the state to agree to administer the
Hmm.
survey for us.
I
And so
see. I see.
they didn't want us
Got it. Got it.
asking very political
Yeah, it
questions.
sounds like a terrific study. It sounds, really on point, like trying to at least see whether and under what circumstances people are getting credit for these improvements. Because if they're not, then it does explain partly why they're not as motivated to do these sort of things. And because anytime you do something new, there's always downside risk. And if there's no upside risk, why are you doing this at some level, right?
That's a huge part, I think, of the political economy. Well, and I've heard this from people working in this space, is that the shadow of the healthcare.gov was so long that politicians were always worried about, well, what if it falls apart? Like, how
Yeah.
do we avoid that happening rather than how do we build something new? And so I think that that is also something that people are deeply concerned about in the space, the sort of risk of failure.
In your experiences with Colorado and that you learned about in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, were those initiatives undertaken by a kind of political pressure from like governors or members of the state legislature, or were those someone, inside the bureaucracy is just sick of how things are going and they can't imagine spending the rest of their career without trying to improve things? Or was it outsiders that were just happened to be located in New Jersey, Colorado, and Pennsylvania who said, I have this capacity, I'd like to bring it? What was the sort of origins of those sort of initiatives, and what can we learn? Can we learn anything in general from those things? Yeah.
I mean, I think one takeaway is the governor has to care about this. That these were, I'll take the example of Pennsylvania. Governor Shapiro campaigned on making government services work better. And then as soon as he was in office, he wrote a couple of executive orders setting up new offices, including Code PA, to bring tech talent to the state. And so he was personally invested in this project. And at this point, I think when you combine that with the lessons of the USDS, where President Obama, helped to create this, but they never had quite the ear of the president over the last 10 years or so. I do think it's crucial to have executive leadership commitment. If it's not the governor, it has to be someone empowered by the governor that people understand he or she is invested in seeing this office make a change.
Okay. So let's see. I think I have a question. Someone asks, how much has Doge set back the civic tech movement?
Well, in practical terms, the people that I've been describing are no longer in the federal government. And so, I think there might still be a couple of old timers at the US Digital Service. Some of them were downsized. Some of them wrote a public letter of resignation. 18F was eliminated. And then there was also individual offices. So, for example, the Office of Transformation in Social Security Administration, the direct file team in IRS, which are basically gone at this point. So the human capital is largely not there anymore. That was built up over the last decade. And I think that was partly for reasons of downsizing. Doge was not looking at 18F and seeing this is Veterans Affairs or this is DOD. This is some weird tech group, and we're tech, so we don't really need them, right? And so they were easy to cut without necessarily thinking about long-term consequences. And then also, I think the experience has been so fraught and negative that you would have some difficulty in getting people to work under the current administration because there is just a sense of conflict around values. Like, what is tech for? Feels to be a huge question in the government space right now, where Doge has its version, the people who are in the civic tech space have their version, and they feel really distant from one another. And I think there is something genuinely tragic about this, because there were a lot of people who were saying, I think Doge might have the opportunity to do some big stuff if they're willing to take on board some of the knowledge from civic tech. If there was a way to blend these two communities, bring the momentum of Doge, bring some of the hard-fought wisdom of civic tech about how to do stuff in government, and marry the two, you might actually have some unique opportunity. And I think that potential just never really came together into a reality.
And I think your point about getting some executive buy-in to these sort of changes, also just highlighting this activity, presumably would have the potential to attract a lot of people to it in a really positive way. And also, just given that I would imagine, at least from some of the things I've read, the civic tech movement, I would say it's not fair to say this, but I would say it's more drawn from the left. The idea that you could then also have folks drawn from, another segment of the political spectrum, it would seem like the potential there for something positive was really, really, really great.
And I want to be optimistic about this. So there are these like test cases for providing better services to veterans. Like we should all agree, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, we should all agree that that is something that we would support. And there has to be some space in American governance where we can agree on some of those basic goals. Okay, government has decided we're going to help veterans, or we're going to provide support for income, or we're going to make it easier to start a business, whatever your policy is, and then get technologists on board with delivering that policy in the best way. And that might involve some building in house, it might involve some contracting out, probably some combination of the two. But those by themselves shouldn't be inherently partisan questions. Um, so,
Yeah.
I still have some hope that, like, my best case scenario now is all of these civic tech people are going to scatter into state governments, and some of them will do remarkable and wonderful things that will be proof of concept for the idea of, tech for good and tech within government as a really good model for any government.
Are there some federal agencies that have like a reputation for being more receptive to these sort of things, putting more emphasis on these sort of things?
So the agency that had gotten the plaudits for the last, I think, both through the Trump and Biden administration was VA. And I think this was in the aftermath of another disaster. So a couple of years after the healthcare.gov disaster, Veterans Health got in trouble because of misrepresenting things like wait times. And they brought in a new head of Veterans Affairs who was very focused on customer orientation and built a huge customer experience team. So hired lots of people who surveyed users all the time, who did user-centered design. They sort of followed users around, recognized things that were working for them, things that could be changed in administrative processes, and then relentlessly tracked how much trust users said they had in Veterans Affairs. And that over time, you could see the trust line just increasing every year from about 58 or 59% in 2015 to about 80% in 2020. And so that was the agency where I think a couple of things came together. It is a sympathetic audience that is being served. They're being served directly by the government. And so government has control over the levers of the service. And there was this huge investment in customer experience skills that use some of the civic tech playbook to actually improve the quality of services.
You mentioned U.S. states. I'm thinking smaller. Are there any cities that have I'm just trying to think of things that there are lots of, which are cities or municipalities. Are there any municipalities that have like some mayor who has made it their thing, like we're going to be, Sarasota. We're going to be the place that gets it right, that is, trying to differentiate him or herself as a politician along the lines of all the different things. We're gonna gather the data we need to know if we're doing a good job. We're gonna make sure our system, our user experience is great. And if it's not, we'll find out and we'll make it better. And has basically gone kind of all in on this vision. I'm trying to think of where people who are interested in this should flock to out of college. Like this is we're going to build the future, and then people will see it.
Yeah, and you would think that that would be an obvious thing to do. And there have been certain cities, like I mentioned, Philadelphia and Boston, that invested early in the space. I think under Mayor Bloomberg, New York had made some strides in this area, but there isn't, to me at least, obvious stars in the space, right? I know some of the civic tech community that have gone and worked in San Francisco, but also San Francisco is often held up as one of those cities that has really deep governance problems and is incredibly procedural, and getting stuff done there is very difficult. And I think part of what that reflects is, you need critical mass. It's easier to do this at a larger level. If you have a bigger city, then the payoff to investing in these sorts of resources is more obvious. But even with that, you again need the executive leadership, but cities are also within our federal system fairly constrained. Like there are limits to what they can and what they can't do. And I think there hasn't been the type of amazing innovation, and maybe like people will post how I'm wrong about this, right? And like, there's a city here that's done incredible work. But I don't think, if you took somewhere like Seoul, or Singapore, that we are on the same par as some of these cities that really have invested strongly in modernizing digital services.
Well, I was going to say, if anyone, any politician or aspiring politician watches a video of this or is in the audience, I guess you're giving them like a playbook to national renown. If they can, capture, it's kind of hard to believe, but they can capture this space in some sense. I guess my last question, unless someone else has another question, I should say one other comment from from a participant says, hello from a former 18F person who was there right up to the end. Thank you, Don, and everyone for calling attention to what we did. I hope we get back to keep doing the work. So I just wanted to recognize that individual and that comment. So substantive comment, then I have just a wrap up, and that is, just can you say a few words? I don't want to get started on this, but it's almost obligatory. As much as the government has been incorporating or failing to incorporate technological developments through 2023 or something like that, we may very well be, or almost obviously, at an inflection point regarding technological capacity with developments in artificial intelligence. How do you see that fitting into this story? Because it seems like there's now, to the extent that it was a shame we weren't innovating and we didn't have a good model for doing it in a cost-effective way without internal capacity to police the external contracts, our needs are now, or our opportunities are now, just all the more massive and potentially exciting, I think, from the standpoint of improving government. What's your sense about how we are currently reacting to those opportunities, and what do you see the sort of promise and perils of that development?
So I think I liken this to electric cars, right? So I drive a traditional gas car, and I'm very confident that 10 years from now, I'll be driving an electric car. But that doesn't mean I'm going to set my gas car on fire in the morning while I'm waiting for that electric car to come. So I think there's a trade-off between the promise of some of these technologies, and I think specifically you're referring to AI and the readiness of those technologies, and also the way in which government is developing them. And DOGE has, I think, a theory of power. We talked about theory of power earlier, which is government should be smaller, there should be less of it, and contracting out and AI can fill the gaps. And sometimes it'll be AI from contractors, but that's their theory for how all of this disruption at the current moment will transition into something better. And that might be right. I don't know. But the early case uses of AI. There was a story about AI being used to monitor VA contracts and dealing with the familiar problems of hallucination, I think are cautionary tales. We have seen some other governments, I'm thinking here of Australia and the Netherlands, where not AI, but the use of algorithms and administrative data um, was used to automate decision making on, for example, welfare seekers or childcare benefit recipients in these two countries, and had really large errors built into the systems that ended up punishing people who had engaged in no wrongdoing. And these became massive political scandals. And so I think one thing, every politician is super excited about AI. I would be very cautious about the political risks of blame that come from when the AI fails. Like if you build an AI that screws up Social Security or Veterans Affairs, people are going to be very, very mad about that. And so I think the lesson that Civic Tech used in other spaces, which was about pilot testing and iterating and making sure that the product is actually ready to go to scale when you're going to deliver it to the mass public, applies here as well.
Great. And let me ask one last question, which is, I think that you've touched on a lot of just fascinating topics. And I mean, the sort of question about civic tech is really a question about government capacity and, what we're able to do through government and how we're able to do things more efficiently. And so maybe we can do more things in a kind of social welfare maximizing world. If you can do the things more efficiently through government, there's just a lot more that you can potentially do that's sort of valuable and helpful to society. Are there other things that you would recommend to people who are interested in this topic to sort of, to get them going on the journey of understanding what the civic tech movement has been and what its possibilities might be?
Yeah, I mentioned Jen Palka before. She writes a blog in the space. And I think we're starting to see folks who are veterans of the civic tech movement now start to realize, oh, we should have done more storytelling. Like part of the problem here is that the public didn't really understand what we were up to. And so more of those folks are out there. And so, for example, I was reading today a blog by Chris Given, who was the lead engineer on the Direct File project, where he was just reflecting on his experience. And I think that's chrisgiven.com. Emily Tavalarius, who was also at the founding of the U.S. Digital Service, has created an oral archive of people who were around in that time period and asked them about how this all came together. And so there is, in a way that wasn't the case, 2 or 3 years ago, there's actually an emerging volume of information about this movement. And I think sadly, it came partly because of this inflection point where many of these folks were pushed out of government. And so now they have some time on their hands. And also they realize, oh, we needed to document what we were doing. We shouldn't have assumed that people would just get what we were doing. And I think that is probably a smart realization.
All right. Well, with that, Don, thank you so much for your work in this area, and thank you for your generosity in sharing your insights with us this evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Alan.
Bye bye.